Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, a series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Franklin Roosevelt, and the focus is Perilous Interregnum. Now here in Presidential Chronicles, we've used that title for a previous episode, going back to 1860-1861, the changeover from James Buchanan to Abraham Lincoln when 7 states seceded from the Union during that period. That was the most perilous interregnum in American history. This is number 2, at least to date. The economy is bottoming out. Some of the worst months of the Great Depression out of an entire decade were these 4 months right here. Plus, there's some critical foreign policy issues that kind of needed to be resolved with implications for Roosevelt's presidency. Now, Roosevelt, he's president-elect. He's thinking maybe a little bit of downtime here, pick his cabinet, work on his inaugural address before he ramps up to being president of the United States. But he got a surprise, a note from the current president, Herbert Hoover, wanting to meet. He wanted to talk about one of these international issues. The United States had loaned a bunch of money to their allies in World War I, and over time those payments were coming back. But during the Depression, many of the European countries were unable to pay. So Hoover had put in place a 1-year moratorium, but that was about to end. And on December 15th, payments were going to be due. Some of those European countries saying, look, we still can't afford to pay. Can you give us an extension? Hoover didn't really want to make this decision on his own because, again, it had implications for Roosevelt's presidency. He wanted to get together. He invited Roosevelt to come to the White House to maybe figure out a joint solution to this. Now, the Roosevelt team was very cautious about this. Ray Moley said that anything was clear to us that Sunday night in Albany, it was that Roosevelt must not be saddled with that responsibility. He wasn't president yet. He shouldn't have the authority. He didn't have the authority to do anything, so he shouldn't have the responsibility either. Moley's stock was clearly on the rise because he was the one person that Roosevelt brought with him to the White House to meet with President Hoover and Secretary of the Treasury Ogden Mills. Just the 4 of them. They were tense. Hoover smoking his cigar, the others smoking cigarettes. Hoover actually held court for about an hour, talking in depth about the debt situation, but in the end, he had a request to make. And Roosevelt had a decision to make. The request was to jointly reconstitute a debt commission to try to figure out what was the best thing to do and to jointly name members of that commission. Roosevelt said, no, look, I'm not the president yet. I don't have the authority to do anything. You're going to have to do this on your own. In fact, he told the press afterwards that it was not his baby. President Hoover, disappointed in this. Both sides were pretty frustrated about it. Hoover decided not to extend the moratorium on those debt payments. Most of the European nations defaulted anyway. Roosevelt would have to deal with that when he becomes president. As for the cabinet, well, the top spot went to Cordell Hull, a senator who had a lot of connections and relationships in Congress, but the House and particularly in the Senate. In fact, Roosevelt said, Cordell Hull is the only member of the cabinet who brings me any political strength that I don't have in my own right. Now, Roosevelt and Hull never really got along. In fact, he didn't really trust Hull very much. Nevertheless, Hull did serve for 11.5 years as Secretary of State under Roosevelt. Treasury Department, going to be absolutely key. The Depression's going on. New Deal legislation is about to be introduced regarding the economy, and the administration coming in reached out to Senator Carter Glass. He's the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee to see if he would take the job. He declined, which was probably a good idea because he was much more conservative than Roosevelt. He was not a big fan of the New Deal. In fact, was kind of a thorn in the side of Roosevelt during his presidency. So instead, Roosevelt went with William Woodin, who had been a big campaign contributor and was a Republican, one of 3 Republicans that Roosevelt brought into the cabinet. The other 2 being Harold Ickes as the Secretary of the Interior and Henry Wallace as the Secretary of Agriculture. Ickes was one of the true New Dealers, kind of through and through. He was also one of only 2 cabinet secretaries to serve the entirety of Roosevelt's lengthy presidency. It was Ickes and Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins being the Secretary of Labor, the first woman to hold a position as a cabinet secretary in any president's cabinet. One other note about the cabinet, Jim Farley, who is now the chair of the Democratic National Committee, got the job as Postmaster General. He'd be in charge of a lot of patronage opportunities with those postal service offices across the country. 12 years of Republican leadership going out, the Democrats are in power, and the patronage, a lot of that stuff is going to fall in Farley's lap. As for the personal staff in the White House, Louis Howe would lead that. He would be Roosevelt's secretary, what we would call chief of staff today. Now, Howe was actually quite ill and getting sicker sort of by the day. He would live in the White House just as he had in the governor's mansion when Roosevelt was governor of New York, but he would basically be confined to his room. He was still a very valuable aide to Roosevelt, an advisor, a confidant to actually both Franklin Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, but again, mostly confined to his room, and others would have to sort of pick up the slack in terms of working directly with Roosevelt. In terms of running the office, well, that would go to Missy Lehand. She would be his personal secretary, also sort of the office gatekeeper, and again, a confidant and an advisor. Grace Tully, who had joined Lehand during the last campaign, or during the campaign, would be in the Oval Office area as well as part of that secretarial team. The brain trust that we talked about in the last episode, those professors from Columbia who had helped Roosevelt in the policy areas during his campaign, well, the brain trust itself really dissolved, but many of the brain trusters, those professors, found jobs within the administration, including Ray Moley. He became an assistant secretary of state. Now, why would he take on that position? Roosevelt said, I'm offering you this one because it has no statutory responsibilities. Basically, I can have you do anything you want. He told Moley, don't you see, you've got to have a job with enough prestige to make it possible for you to deal with people of importance for me. But that's all the title has to mean. Nothing else has to change. We just continue. You'll keep advising me. We'll focus on economic stuff, even though you'll be an assistant secretary of state. Now, this had problems written all over it because the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, was now going to have a subordinate that basically is going around him directly to the president. This was not going to end well, but Roosevelt was fine, and Moley signed on for the job. Others of the brain trusters, Rex Tugwell, his specialty was agriculture, so he became an assistant secretary in that cabinet agency. And Hugh Johnson, who joined the campaign a little bit later than some of the other brain trusters. He was a former military officer, a hard-charging, bombastic kind of a guy. He was itching to get a job in a New Deal leadership position, and that would come along once the New Deal legislation started to roll out. Early January, another request from Herbert Hoover to meet, and again, it was foreign policy related. The British were planning a conference, a World Economic Conference in London for 1933. Almost all the top economies in the world had gone off the gold standard during the Depression. Really, the United States and France were the only two who did not do that. Well, Britain was trying to figure out a way for some international economic stabilization by getting countries back on the gold standard, and they were going to hold a conference to this effect. Well, Hoover's thinking that this is important not only for right now, but important for Roosevelt's administration because the conference would take place on his watch. He invited Roosevelt, came to the White House, they talked about it, and Hoover had a request. Again, let's name jointly the commissioners. We're going to support this conference and send these people that they would jointly name to it, and Roosevelt again said no. I'm not the president. I have no authority. I'm not going to engage on this. You're going to have to make that decision, and I'll deal with it when I'm president. Early February, Roosevelt goes on a 2-week vacation. It's a Caribbean cruise on the Vincent Astor's yacht called Normahal. When he gets back, lands in Miami, Florida, and decides to go and give a few remarks at the annual encampment of the American Legion, meeting at Bayfront Park near Miami. About 20,000 people were there, and he spoke for just a couple of minutes from the top of the back seat of his open-air car. As soon as he's done talking, 5 shots rang out. 5 shots from a .32 caliber revolver in the hands of Giuseppe Zangara, who is an unemployed bricklayer. Now, 5 people were hit, but not Franklin Roosevelt, in part because of a hero, a bystander, a woman by the name of Lillian Cross, who saw what Zangara was doing, and she hit him with her handbag. She was so close that she got powder burns on her right cheek. Now, of the 5 people that were hit, only one was serious, and that was the Chicago mayor, Anton Cermak, who was actually talking to Roosevelt when the shots rang out. Now, when the shots came, the Secret Service yelled to get Roosevelt's car out of there as quickly as possible, but Roosevelt actually yelled, "Stop. We're going to take Cermak to the hospital." So they took a moment, got him in the car. Roosevelt's holding him as they're heading to the hospital, but he's not optimistic. Roosevelt said later, "He was alive, but I didn't think he was going to last. I talked to Mayor Cermak nearly all the way. I remember I said, 'Tony, keep quiet, don't move. It won't hurt if you keep quiet.'" Well, Cermak survived for about 2 weeks before he passed. Zangara went to court, was completely unapologetic. He hated all leaders. He hated all capitalists. You want to punish him, a death penalty, whatever it is, fine with me. he? Well, he did get the death penalty, and he was executed in the electric chair in Florida about a month after pulling the trigger. But that night, the night of the assassination attempt, FDR and his party went back to the normal hall for the rest of the evening. Now, Roosevelt was typically the calmest person in the room, obviously most optimistic person in the room, and the calmest in the room, and this was no different. Back to the normal hall as if nothing had happened. According to Ray Moley, who was there was nothing, not so much as the twitching of a muscle, the mopping of a brow, or even the hint of a false gaiety to indicate it wasn't any other evening in any other place. Roosevelt was simply himself, easy, confident, poised, to all appearances unmoved. Roosevelt, tremendous ability to compartmentalize, stay calm in a crisis, pretty good characteristics if you're going to be President of the United States. The country, in the meantime, is still in trouble. It's less than a month now before Roosevelt does take on the responsibilities of the presidency, but once again, Herbert Hoover doesn't think it can wait because the banking system in the United States is essentially collapsing. There's a lot of fear, there's panic. People are thinking as banks collapse, they got to go in and pull their money out before they lose it. There was no insurance at the time for anything like that, and so it could be just lost for good. So there's hoarding of cash, hoarding of gold, banks are collapsing left and right, and so Hoover decides to once again reach out to Roosevelt, this time a handwritten note. He said in that note, "A most critical situation has arisen in the country of which I feel it's my duty to advise you confidentially. The major difficulty is state of public mind. There is a steadily degenerating confidence in the future which has reached the height of general alarm. I am convinced that a very early statement by you upon 2 or 3 policies of your administration would serve greatly to restore confidence and cause a resumption of the march of recovery." Kind of putting the blame a little bit on Roosevelt because his silence, according to Hoover, was creating this fear of the unknown, creating the panic, creating the bank runs, and causing a lot of this problem. And so maybe Roosevelt could make a public statement and start to calm some of these nerves. Roosevelt thought about this for a few days before he responded, but once again, he had nothing to say publicly. He told the president in his note, "I'm equally concerned with you in regard to the gravity of the present banking situation. But my thought is it's so very deep-seated that the fire is bound to spread in spite of anything that is done by way of mere statements." He's not the president yet. He's going to have to wait until he takes the oath of office before he starts talking as if he was the President of the United States. Well, in the meantime, this crisis is getting very, very serious, and the states on their own decided to act. Michigan shut down all of its banks. Maryland was next. Pretty soon, by March the 2nd, just 2 days before the inauguration, 21 states had declared bank holidays, but things were still perilous. And on March the 3rd, the next day, just 1 day to go in the Hoover presidency, they had the traditional tea and the handover between the president-elect, and their immediate families at the White House, but this one was uncharacteristically tense. The banking system might collapse, might not literally survive one more day, was the view of Hoover and his administration leaders. Hoover and Roosevelt and a couple actually made it their way into the Red Room where they're having this discussion again. Mr. President-elect, can't you say something to try to calm this down a little bit? In fact, they called for Ray Moley, who was a few blocks away at the Mayflower Hotel. You got to hustle over here. They're having an intense policy discussion. But once again, Roosevelt, same answer. I'll be president tomorrow, and I'll deal with this then. You say it might not last till then. Again, you're the president, Mr. Hoover. You have to deal with that now. I'll deal with it after I take the oath of office. The bitterness between Hoover and Roosevelt was reaching sort of an apex, and it would basically not go down as their political rivalry would continue on for the rest of Roosevelt's life. Moley and William Woodin, who was the designate for Treasury Secretary, actually spent that entire night with Hoover's team at the Treasury Department. Their goal was to get all of the states to voluntarily shut down their banks. Again, a national bank holiday on a voluntary basis, and that is what happened. By the wee hours in the morning, all of the states had agreed to shut their banks. The New York Stock Exchange was shut as well. They're going to give the new president a little bit of time to make his inaugural address and figure out what he was going to do. So all the eyes were now going to be on Washington. What is that new president going to do to help us out with this banking crisis? That is the story for another day. That's Franklin Roosevelt, Perilous Interregnum, from the life of Franklin Roosevelt. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.